Today we're going to learn about multiplying complex numbers with integers and imaginary numbers. Before we start multiplying complex numbers, let's first recap on what a complex number is. A complex number is a number that can be written in the form of a plus bi, where a and b are real numbers, and I is an imaginary number. Also, this term is called the real term. And this term is called the imaginary term. So this term is the imaginary term, which is bi, and a is the real term. Now let's recap on what I is. I is the square root of -1. The reason it's called an imaginary number is because there is no square root of -1. So now let's solve this first problem. 3 times 2 into parentheses. 3 times into parentheses 2 plus 3i. So we know that whenever we multiply terms outside the parentheses with terms inside the parentheses, we have to distribute the terms that are outside the parentheses with the terms that are inside the parentheses. So we have to distribute 3 with 2 and 3 with 3i. So we get that it is equal to 3 times 2 plus 3 times 3i. So this is equal to 3 times 2 is 6 plus 3 times 3i is 9i. So the answer to this first question is 6 plus 9i. Now let's move on to the second question. -5 times into parentheses 4 plus 3i. So we have to distribute the -5 with 4 and the -5 with 3i. So we get that it is equal to -5 times 4 plus -5 times 3i. So plus -5 times 3i. So this is equal to -5 times 4 is -20 plus -5 times 3i, which is -15i. And we know that it is equal to -20, and we know that plus and minus becomes minus, so -15i. So the answer to the second problem is -20 minus 15i. Now let's move on to the third problem, which is 3i times into parentheses 4 plus 2i. So we have to distribute 3i with 4 and 3i with 2i. So we get 3 I times 4 plus 3I times 2I is 2i better? So it's equal to 12i plus 3i times 2i is 6i squared. Because I times I is I squared. Now, let's think about something for a second. So, we know that I is equal to the square root of negative 1. So, what would I squared be? So, we know that if I is equal to negative 1, then the square root of negative 1. So then the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 would be negative 1. So that means that I squared is equal to negative 1. Because the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 is equal to negative 1. So this is equal to 12i plus 6 times I squared, which is negative 1, which is equal to 12i plus negative 6, or minus 6, because plus and minus becomes minus. So the answer to this question is 12i minus 6. Now let's move on to the last question, which is, the last question is negative 5i, let's make a line there, which is negative 5i times, in parentheses, 8 minus 6i. So we have to distribute negative 5i with 8 and negative 5i with 6i, with negative 6i, because that's a minus there. So we get negative 5i times 8 plus negative 5i times negative 6i. So we have negative 5i times 8 plus negative 5i times negative 6i. So, let's make parentheses here. So, this is equal to negative 5i times 8 is negative 40i plus negative 5i times negative 6i is 30i squared. So plus 30i squared. And we know that I squared, because negative 5i times negative 6i is 30i squared, because negative times negative is positive. Now we know that I squared is equal to negative 1. So we get it is equal to negative 40i plus 30 times negative 1, which is negative 30. And we know that when we have plus negative 30, it is the same thing as minus 30. So, the answer to the last question is, because plus and minus is minus, and the answer to the last question is negative 40i minus 30. Today we learned about multiplying complex numbers with integers and imaginary numbers. Thank you for watching this video.